President Donald Trump has named a board of peace to oversee post-war Gaza. Sir Tony Blair, private equity boss Mark Warren, and the US President's son-in-law Jared Kushner will be among its members. The names also include US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, World Bank President Ajay Banga, and a US National Security Advisor Robert Gabriel. All members will oversee Trump's 20-point peace plan for Gaza. Our North America correspondent David Willis has the latest.
A former envoy to the Middle East, Sir Tony Blair's appointment to Donald Trump's Board of Peace is nonetheless controversial. There were reports as recently as last month that he'd been sidelined following objections from several Muslim and Arab states over his role in the US-led invasion of Iraq in 2003. The release of Israeli hostages held by Hamas marked the first phase of Donald Trump's plan to end the conflict in Gaza.
All right, everyone, John here, so let's get started. At the Munich Security Conference, Secretary of State Marco Rubio delivered a speech that surprised European allies with its traditional diplomatic tone, so warm and professionally received that the coverage traveled across the Atlantic and demanded a response from the Oval Office. The moment reveals the tension between Rubio's approach and Trump's brand of foreign policy. Here's what the response was. Trump, speaking at a subsequent event at the U.S. Institute of Peace, looked out at the crowd and essentially said he almost fired Rubio for giving a speech that was too good, not too controversial, not wrong in some fundamental policy sense, not embarrassing to the administration in any way, too good. The speech landed so well with European allies and with the international press that people in the room and in the coverage were asking a question that apparently got under Trump's skin. Why didn't the president himself give a speech like that?
Phase 2 involves cementing a fragile ceasefire and rebuilding a territory devastated by more than 2 years of war, overseen by this new Board of Peace. Chaired by Donald Trump, the board's 7 founder members include both the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and his special envoy, Steve Witkoff, who together were credited with brokering the recent ceasefire in Gaza. Other members include the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, another of Mr. Trump's trusted aides. On his Truth social media platform, the president called it the greatest and most prestigious board ever assembled at any time. Yet conspicuous by their absence are any Palestinian or Arab names. The White House has said additional appointments will follow. From the ruins that now constitute Gaza, Donald Trump has talked of creating a Riviera-style resort destination. Yet the territory's immediate future remains deeply uncertain. Israel and Hamas have each accused the other of violating the current ceasefire, and Hamas has yet to publicly commit to a full disarmament in Gaza. David Willis, BBC News, Washington.
The comparison between what Rubio sounded like in Munich and what Trump sounds like when he speaks about foreign policy was apparently uncomfortable enough that Trump felt the need to publicly preempt it with a joke about firing Rubio for it. And let me read you his exact words because they are worth sitting with. He said, and I quote, "I was so proud I nearly ended his employment because people were asking, why didn't I do it?" And then he added a warning delivered with a smile, but unmistakably direct. "Marco, please don't outperform your last speech. If you do, you're out of here." Now, let me just pause right there because I want you to really think about what you just heard. The President of the United States, standing in front of an audience at a respected policy institution, publicly told his Secretary of State that he almost fired him for giving a speech that was too impressive.
Steven Zunes is the Director of Middle East Studies at the University of San Francisco. He told me what he makes of the newly announced board.
It seems that it includes a number of people who aren't exactly considered objective personalities when it comes to Israel-Palestine. We've had Jared Kushner, who has talked openly about ethnically cleansing the territory and because of the valuable resort property. You have Marco Rubio, who has steadfastly opposed a two-state solution, believe all the land belongs to Israel, has even supported the settlements. And of course, Donald Trump himself, who's used that's Palestinian as a pejorative against political opponents and the like. And so I think given that you're not going to have any Palestinians on this committee, and they did not turn it over to the Palestine Authority, which is the recognized government of Palestine by 157 countries, I'm afraid many Palestinians across the political spectrum will see this as kind of a neo-colonial setup.
Do you think the board will have the confidence of some Palestinians, Arab leaders, and crucially Israel as well?
That the international community responded to warmly. That made America look competent and serious on the world stage. And then he warned him not to do it again quite that well, or he would be removed from his position. If that doesn't make you stop and think about what kind of leadership culture exists at the highest levels of American government right now, I don't know what will. Because this is not just a funny anecdote about cabinet dynamics. This is not just a throwaway joke that got reported as a quirky moment in a long administration. This is a window into something deeply revealing about how this president operates, about what he values in the people who work for him, and about what happens when someone in his orbit starts to look too good at their job. And here is the really fascinating part. This is not an isolated incident.
Perhaps Israel, but again, I think with the lack of Arab representation and with people who are hostile to even the most modest of Palestinian aspirations, it may just really feed Hamas's narrative, that the world is stacked against them and they need to embrace this kind of extremism. And the good thing, of course, is that if they are able to establish some kind of technocratic authority, and so that Hamas is no longer the governing entity in Gaza, I mean, obviously that's a step forward. And if it also inhibits Israel from its ongoing violations of ceasefire, that's obviously a positive thing as well. But in terms of the longer range plans of bringing real peace and security, let alone justice, I'm relatively skeptical of this, the makeup of this committee.
Of course, the Trump administration will say that it has brought about the ceasefire that's now in place and that it's committed to the reconstruction of Gaza. You mentioned the Palestinian Technocratic Committee that will be set up under this plan. How independent do you think it will be?
This is a pattern with documented history stretching back to the earliest days of Trump's first term. Rex Tillerson was widely written about as the adult in the room when it came to foreign policy, the experienced executive who understood how governments work and who spoke the language that international partners recognized as serious. He lasted less than 2 years and got fired by tweet. The pattern is clear and consistent. Mattis, Haley, and others who developed independent reputations for competence and seriousness found their relationships with Trump increasingly untenable. Now Rubio, fresh off a Munich speech that generated the kind of international press that historically triggers that reaction, faces the same test.
It's hard to say. I mean, Trump very much likes to control things. He has his own vision, and he's been not very supportive of any kind of Palestinian self-governance. At the same time, if they do seem to be the kind of people who are serious about reconstruction and rebuilding the area in a way that meets the needs of the population, as opposed to a kind of disaster capitalism, if you will, that in which Trump and his cronies might try to take advantage of the situation for financial gains. Yeah, I think it could move things forward because people are desperate right now. They've had decades of siege and misgovernment and repression by Hamas. They've had this devastating war. So any sense of normalcy, any kind of moving forward, obviously would be a positive development.
The thoughts of Professor Zunez from the University of San Francisco there.
Whether he can maintain credibility without becoming too independent for a president who needs to be the biggest figure in every story. But here is what makes this story more complicated than a simple narrative about a falling out waiting to happen. Rubio is not just a cabinet official who got some nice coverage on an overseas trip. Trump expanded his portfolio to make him acting national security advisor as well, which means Rubio simultaneously holds the two most senior and consequential foreign policy positions in the executive branch. He is not a peripheral figure. He is the person running American foreign policy on a day-to-day operational basis with the portfolio and the institutional authority to match.
And at Munich, that person gave a speech that European allies and defense ministers and foreign policy professionals responded to with something that looked unmistakably like relief. Because it sounded like the traditional American understanding of what American leadership means in the world. It sounded like someone who knew what they were doing and who understood the system they were operating in. Rubio in Munich was getting standing ovations from the European allies who had been anxious about American foreign policy under this administration. Now think about the contrast here. At roughly the same time, Trump was getting booed at the NBA Finals in his own home city. Those are two very different and very publicly documented images of American leadership playing out in the same political moment. One American official being warmly embraced by international allies for sounding like a traditional statesman, another American official being publicly jeered by domestic sports fans. And what those two images mean for the internal dynamics of the Trump administration, for the foreign policy of the United States, and for the political landscape that is quietly forming in the spaces beyond Trump's second term. That is what we are going to get into today. Let's actually get into this because there are several layers to this story and each one adds something important to the full picture. Let's start with Rubio's political arc, because understanding where he came from and how he got to where he is makes what happened in Munich significantly more meaningful and more revealing as a political story. Marco Rubio was one of the leading voices of the interventionist, hawkish wing of the Republican foreign policy establishment for the better part of a decade in the United States Senate. He believed in American engagement abroad. He believed in maintaining alliances and projecting American power through a combination of military strength and diplomatic leadership in the traditional post-World War II American role as the anchor of the international order it helped construct. He was a kind of Republican foreign policy voice that European allies recognized and felt comfortable dealing with. He spoke the language of the international system they operated in with fluency and evident conviction. During the 2016 Republican primary, Rubio and Trump clashed significantly on foreign policy. Rubio represented the traditional and establishment GOP foreign policy vision that Trump was explicitly running against. Trump attacked people like Rubio as globalists and internationalists, using those terms as political attacks against the vision of American international engagement that Rubio had spent his career championing. They were on opposite sides of a fundamental debate about what America's role in the world should be, and Rubio adapted in a very specific way that is worth understanding. He went through a period of public criticism of Trump after 2016, then gradually moved toward accommodation, then toward active and visible alignment. By the time Trump offered him the Secretary of State position, Rubio had reshaped his public positioning on enough substantive foreign policy questions that the nomination made political and ideological sense within the Trump administration framework. He had moved toward Trump's line on Ukraine, where he had been a clear interventionist hawk in ways that made his service as the face of Trump's foreign policy coherent rather than constantly contradictory. Analysis pieces describe this process as shape-shifting. And that word captures something important about both what happened and what it required of Rubio as a political figure and as a person with a long and well-documented public record on foreign policy that was suddenly being asked to move. He retooled himself to fit the space available to him in Trump's world. He did what is required to survive and advance when the alternative is irrelevance. He got in line and stayed there long enough and consistently enough to eventually be handed the two most senior foreign policy positions simultaneously. But Munich suggests something really interesting about what happens when that shape-shifted version of Rubio gets in front of an international audience that is looking for something very specific from America. Because when Rubio stood at the Munich Security Conference and spoke to European defense ministers, NATO partners, and foreign policy professionals who have been anxious and uncertain about the direction of American foreign policy under this administration, what came out of him sounded less like the accommodated Trump surrogate and more like the original version, the traditional American commitments, the language of alliance maintenance, the signal that the United States understands its role in the international order it helped build and has maintained for nearly 80 years. Whether that was strategically calculated on Rubio's part, a deliberate performance of a version of himself designed to land well with a specific audience, or whether it reflected what he actually believes when he is operating in his most natural professional environment, is something only he knows. But the audience responded to it in ways that were unmistakable and that generated the kind of press coverage that eventually travels back to Washington. They responded warmly with the kind of visible relief that gets written into diplomatic dispatches and foreign policy analyses, and that circulates back to the people who briefed the president and eventually to the president himself. The coverage that came back said Rubio did something in Munich that the people in that room were grateful for. Something that sounded like the version of American leadership they have been hoping to hear and that they are not always certain they will get from this administration. And that was apparently enough to make Trump feel the need to joke about almost firing him for it while simultaneously telling him not to do it again quite that well. Now here's the thing about that joke. The "I almost fired him for that speech" comment at the U.S. Institute of Peace event that I want to spend real time analyzing rather than just acknowledging. It is being reported as a joke, and it is clearly being delivered with a smile, and Trump is laughing when he says it, and the room is laughing. But if you have been watching how Trump operates with his senior people for any length of time, you understand that his jokes about firing people and his actual firings of people operate on a very short and well-documented continuum. The warning is real even when the delivery is funny. And the specific content of the warning, "Don't outperform your last speech. If you do, you're out of here," is a public statement to Rubio that is heard by everyone in the room and then repeated in every outlet that covers the event. Whatever Trump meant it as privately, it functions publicly as a declaration of the terms under which Rubio is permitted to be good at his job. You can be good, but there are limits. And the limits are defined by how my image compares to yours. When people see both of us performing on the same stage, when they start asking why I didn't give a speech like that, when they start comparing the two of us and finding you more impressive in that context, that is when we have a problem. That is the framework Trump has always operated by with his subordinates, and Rubio's Munich moment is the clearest recent test of where exactly that limit sits for the person who's currently the face of American foreign policy to the world. Now let's talk about what the Munich speech itself represents in the context of Rubio's expanded role. Because the dual title situation makes the political implications significantly more serious than if this were just a cabinet official getting good reviews on an overseas trip. When Trump made Rubio acting national security advisor in addition to Secretary of State, he made one person simultaneously the public face and the operational manager of American foreign policy at the highest level. That is an extraordinary concentration of foreign policy responsibility, and the gap between what Rubio sounds like in Munich and what Trump sounds like on foreign policy is not in that context a gap between a supporting player and the lead. It is a gap between the person actually running the day-to-day foreign policy of the United States and the president who nominally directs it. That gap, expressed publicly at Munich, acknowledged by the European allies who responded to it, acknowledged by Trump in his joke, is a structural feature of the current American foreign policy situation that European governments and American diplomats and congressional overseers are all navigating in real time. Think about what that means for how the rest of the world views the United States right now. When European defense ministers are sitting in that room in Munich, listening to Rubio sound like the traditional American statesman they have been hoping to hear, and then they turn on their televisions and see Trump saying something completely different about the same issues, what are they supposed to make of that? Which version of American foreign policy is the real one? Which version should they base their planning on? Which version will actually govern American actions in a crisis? That ambiguity created by the gap between how Rubio sounds and how Trump sounds when they are each being themselves is a structural feature of the current American foreign policy situation that has real consequences for how alliances function and how international partners make decisions about their relationships with Washington. And Rubio's Munich speech didn't close that gap. It made it more visible, more public, more undeniable. And that is precisely what seems to have triggered Trump's reaction. Then there is the post-Trump positioning dimension, which is real and which is being actively noticed by people inside the Republican Party who think seriously about these things. Commentators and GOP insiders have begun pointing out that Rubio's Munich moment, his expanded portfolio, his evident performance competence in traditional foreign policy context, the warmth of the international response, All of it positions him in a specific and unusual way for whatever comes after Trump's second term. Here's what makes that positioning specific rather than just generic. Every former Trump official who manages to build a genuine reputation for competence and seriousness without being perceived by the base as disloyal, who accumulates foreign policy credentials and international standing while remaining aligned enough with the MAGA world to stay in the administration, is building something for the political future that extends beyond Trump's presidency. The question is how many of them can do it while remaining inside the relationship rather than being forced outside it. The ones who leave eventually, Mattis, Haley, others, can build reputations, but they lose the base alignment that makes those reputations transferable in a Republican primary environment. Rubio right now is trying to do something rarer and harder, build the credentials while staying inside. And Munich was a significant advancement of that project, regardless of whether he intended it that way. The international standing it produced, the visible warmth of the European response, the image of a credible American statesman at a premier international security forum. And then Trump's joke about almost firing him for it, which functions as confirmation that what Rubio built in Munich was real and significant enough to make the most politically perceptive person in American politics uncomfortable. All of that together is a meaningful piece of political infrastructure for someone who is thinking about what comes after the current moment. And the specific question of what Rubio does with that infrastructure, whether he plays it carefully and survives inside the administration until the natural end, or whether the tension Trump expressed in his joke eventually becomes something more serious and forces an earlier resolution, that is the story that is going to unfold over the next year and a half. The chess piece moved in Munich. Trump noticed. The question of what comes next is the live political drama underneath the story of a Secretary of State who gave a good speech. Let's think about the documented history here because it really does illuminate what Rubio is navigating. Rex Tillerson came into the administration with a reputation as a serious and capable executive. He had run ExxonMobil, one of the largest and most complex corporations in the world. He understood how international negotiations worked. He knew the players. He spoke the language of global commerce and diplomacy, and for a while he was the face of American foreign policy in many international contexts. But over time, the gap between how Tillerson operated and how Trump operated became impossible to ignore. Tillerson would go to international meetings and sound like a traditional American statesman. Trump would say something completely different back in Washington. The allies didn't know which version to believe. The administration didn't know how to reconcile the two. And eventually, Tillerson was gone, dismissed via Twitter in a manner that seemed designed to maximize the humiliation. James Mattis was another one, the general with a legendary military career who was respected by allies and adversaries alike. He understood the importance of alliances.
He believed in the traditional American role as the anchor of the international security order. And he tried to operate within that framework while serving an administration that was constantly pushing against it. Eventually, he couldn't do it anymore. His resignation letter was a public statement of principle that made headlines precisely because it was so clearly at odds with the president's approach. Nikki Haley was the UN ambassador who built a profile as a credible and serious voice on the world stage. She could walk into any international forum and be taken seriously on her own terms. She developed relationships with foreign diplomats. She spoke with authority about American foreign policy, and eventually that independent profile became a problem. The relationship became difficult. She left. So when Trump tells Rubio not to outperform his last speech, or he's out of there, he is invoking a pattern that has played out multiple times before. And Rubio knows this history. He has watched it unfold from his position in the Senate. He has seen what happened to the people who got too much good press, who developed too much independent standing, who started to sound like they could do this without Trump. He knows the risks.
And yet, there he was in Munich, delivering a speech that sounded exactly like the kind of thing that has historically gotten people in trouble with this president. Whether that was intentional or not, whether he was just being himself in an environment where he felt comfortable, whether he was making a calculated move to build his own standing for the future, only he knows. But the result is the same. He gave a speech that made the comparison between him and Trump visible and uncomfortable. And Trump responded with a public warning. Let's bring this all the way home and look at the full picture of what this Munich moment really means. There are several important dimensions to this story, and each one adds something different and important to our understanding of what's happening inside this administration and what it means for American foreign policy and for the political future. The Munich speech and Trump's reaction to it revealed the specific and fundamental tension that exists at the center of the Trump administration's relationship with competent officials. And it is a tension that has ended every significant foreign policy relationship Trump has had, going back to the beginning of his first term. Here is the core dynamic stated as plainly as possible. Trump needs people around him who are good enough at their jobs to make the administration function at the level a White House requires. Who can go to Munich and represent the United States in ways that maintain basic credibility with international partners and that do not create foreign policy crisis through incompetence or tone deafness. That is a genuine operational need. The country requires it, the alliance system requires it. The day-to-day functioning of American foreign policy requires people in the senior positions who know what they are doing and who can perform competently in the international spaces those positions occupy. But Trump also needs those same people to stay fully subordinated to his brand, to not develop independent reputations that can be perceived as standing on their own or competing with his. To not give speeches that prompt people to ask why Trump himself is not doing what his officials are doing. To not create the kind of comparison that puts Trump at the smaller end. Those two requirements, be good enough to do the job and don't be so good that the comparison becomes uncomfortable, are in permanent and irresolvable tension for anyone actually doing the job at the level it requires and the level the world demands. In the documented history of what happened to Tillerson and Mattis and Haley, all of whom were genuinely good at what they did, all of whom built reputations that eventually became a problem in their relationship with Trump, is the evidence base for understanding what the "don't outperform your last speech" line actually means when you hear it in that context. The dual role makes this moment significantly more consequential than a typical story about a cabinet official getting good press. Because Rubio, simultaneously as Secretary of State and acting National Security Advisor, is not a supporting character in the foreign policy story. He is the author of it, in ways that create a visible and publicly acknowledged gap between what American foreign policy sounds like when Rubio performs it and what it sounds like when Trump performs it. That gap was on display in Munich in a documented and internationally witnessed way. It was acknowledged by the European allies and security professionals who responded warmly to what Rubio was saying. It was acknowledged by Trump himself in his joke about almost firing Rubio for the speech, which is itself a public confirmation that the gap existed and that it was noticed by the people in a position to notice it most directly. It is now part of the public record of what this administration looks like in the current moment. European governments, American diplomats, and congressional overseers are all working with that public record as they try to understand what American foreign policy actually is, which version of American leadership they are dealing with in any given moment. That ambiguity, created by the gap between how Rubio sounds and how Trump sounds when they are each being themselves, is a structural feature of the current American foreign policy situation that has real consequences for how alliances function and how international partners make decisions about their relationships with Washington. The post-Trump political positioning angle is the dimension of this story that is going to matter most over the next several years. And Munich may have been Rubio's most significant single move in building the combination of credentials that would make him a plausible standard bearer for the Republican foreign policy vision after Trump's second term ends. Here's what Rubio has accumulated in a relatively short time through a specific combination of loyalty, adaptability, and genuine performance competence. He has the institutional authority that comes from holding the two most senior foreign policy positions in the executive branch simultaneously, a concentration of formal power that is rare in any administration. He has the international standing that comes from being received warmly at Munich as a credible and traditional American statesman, the kind of standing that European allies and foreign policy professionals assign based on what they hear and whether it sounds serious and reliable to them. He has the base credibility from having been sufficiently aligned with Trump to earn and keep these roles through a period when Trump's tolerance for independent behavior has been demonstrably low. And he has the specific drama of Trump's public joke about almost firing him for the Munich speech, which somewhat counterintuitively functions as a public confirmation that Rubio is doing something significant enough to make the most politically perceptive person in American politics take note and feel the need to issue a warning. The way Rubio has accumulated these elements from inside the administration while remaining visibly aligned without a dramatic public break is specifically different from how the previous generation of aspirants to similar positions accumulated art stage. Their credentials, they built their reputations outside the relationship and eventually could not sustain both. Rubio is attempting to do it inside the relationship while remaining. Whether that is ultimately sustainable is the question the next chapter of this story will answer. Rubio gave a speech in Munich that European allies warmly received as traditional American leadership, so well that Trump publicly joked he almost fired him for outperforming him, warning not to do it again. The pattern of talented officials whose independent competence becomes incompatible with serving Trump is well documented, and the question is whether Rubio can maintain the impossible balance, or join the list of those who were simply too good at their job.